More than 200 demonstrators were arrested Sunday at the Nevada test site. And outside the Pantex plant in Texas, about 200 peace activists prayed and sang in unison. Pantex is the final assembly point for every nuclear warhead in the U.S. arsenal. The observance marks the 4th year of peaceful gathering by activists outside the controversial facility. Protesters at the Rocky Flats nuclear plant in Colorado were less constrained, though. As Lisa Exon reports, more than 200 people were arrested after trying to force a one-day shutdown at the plant.
The protesters started gathering way before dawn, many of them taking firm positions in front of the main gate. Their object was to try and keep employees from going in, thereby shutting down the Rocky Flats plant. They came from all walks of life and used various means to set the mood. By sunrise, the group of protesters had risen to more than 200. The number of state troopers had swelled as well.
We will do our best to be cooperative, and we ask the same from each of you.
When Rocky Flats federal officers opened the gates at 6:30 a.m., the arrest began. It was supposed to be a nonviolent protest, but the resistance offered gave troopers a struggle. One by one, they were pulled apart. Most of the protesters made themselves dead weight and were either dragged or carried to buses to be hauled off. Amid it all, they kept chanting. Shut it down! Shut it down! And the hours passed. When the human blockade got thin, reinforcements took their places on the ground.
We're here to close the plant, and anything we could do non-violently to prolong our action and stay here for as long as possible.
Most were determined to stay put, and many wrenched in pain brought on by their own determination. The troopers kept their cool for the most part, but sometimes their patience was tried. After 5 hours and several busloads full, more than 220 arrests were made. The majority of those received tickets and were sent home.
To a nuclear weapons plant. The demonstrators blocked the gate here for 5 hours before police moved in. 150 were arrested.
We don't believe in Rocky Flats. We live here.
Inside, employees couldn't leave. They kept on working, so production never stopped.
Rocky Flats nuclear weapons plant in Colorado, and more than 200 were taken into custody at the Nevada test site. The protesters were marking the 42nd anniversary of the bombing of Nagasaki.
Site. About 150 pro-nuclear activists took part in a counter-demonstration nearby. In Colorado yesterday, police arrested 320 anti-nuclear protesters who tried to shut down the Rocky Flats nuclear weapons plant. Officials from 4 California cities were among those arrested. The Rocky Flats plant, operated by the Rockwell Corporation, makes plutonium triggers for nuclear weapons. Police say most of those arrested in Colorado and Nevada were charged with trespassing and then released.
Philadelphia and Texas say nuclear weapons mean suicide for the human race. About 200 demonstrators gathered at the plant yesterday to mark the 42nd anniversary of the bombing of Nagasaki. Darwin Morgan looks at a similar protest in Nevada.
In groups of 2, 3, and 4, the anti-nuclear supporters crossed onto the Nevada test site. Their non-violent gesture of civil disobedience is to protest the government's nuclear testing program. And on this day also, to remember the 200,000 killed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. The anti-nuclear group says this is what our world could turn into if nuclear testing continues. But nearly 200 pro-nuclear supporters, many test site employees and their families, were also on hand. They feel very differently about this country's testing program. Some conveyed the message in the signs they carried. Others in the slogans they chanted.
You save the seals, we'll save the country.
Anti-nuclear protesters came from all across the country, some from as far away as Connecticut. And as they approached the cattle guard that marks the line of trespass, the pro-nuclear group began to ask why.
What work do you do? I work for the U.S. government. You're a teacher? You work for the U.S. government? They should fire you. They really should fire you.
While most of the protesters are content with crossing the cattle guard and getting arrested for trespassing, there are the few who will resist arrest by lying in the middle of the road. 3 pitted their wills against those of the test site security force. Those who would try to aid their friends were pushed back to the side of the road. And after nearly a half hour under the hot desert sun, the 3 were forcibly carried from the road. 117 people were arrested.
5,000 mourners gathered at Peace Park yesterday in memory of the 42nd anniversary of the city's atomic bombing by the United States. And in this country, anti-nuclear protesters also marks the Nagasaki bombing anniversary. Police say 320 demonstrators were arrested at the Rocky Flats nuclear plant in Colorado yesterday. Authorities say as many as 500 people blocked the plant's two main gates and refused to leave.
The U.S. atomic bombing of Nagasaki. Near Mercury, Nevada yesterday, more than 200 people were arrested for trespassing at the Nevada test site. They were taken into custody and later released. Those arrested including 4 local officials from Southern California cities. There were also pro-nuclear demonstrators at the same site yelling slogans and singing. That group was made up mostly of people employed by or affiliated with the Nevada test site, that is. Several hundred demonstrators marched on the main gates of the Rocky Flats nuclear weapons plant near Denver, Colorado. More than 300 people were arrested on misdemeanor charges and released. And police arrested about 220 people, that is, who entered the Trident submarine base in Bangor, Washington, in a third protest marking the U.S. attack on Nagasaki.